Hello and a very warm welcome back to Autism Unpacked. I'm your host, Rosie Gilmoss. Throughout this series, we'll be exploring the many facets of autism by chatting with both experts and those who have first-hand experience. Whether you're a parent on this journey or you're just curious, we're here to have the big conversations and get you the answers and understanding that you need. Today's episode tackles the topic of demand avoidance. You might have heard of PDA or pathological demand avoidance, but how much do you really know? We'll discover its impact on young people and their families, share insights into their experiences and challenges, and share strategies that might help. So without further ado, let's meet today's guests. I'm delighted to welcome to the show Chief Clinical Lead, Dr. Freya Spicer-White, and Paula Walker, Deputy Head of Clinical Operations, both from Options Autism. Hello, Freya, and welcome back. It's great to have you on. Would you start just by telling us a little bit about your role at Options Autism?
Yeah, hi Rose, it's lovely to be back. So my role is a Chief Clinical Officer, and what that means is I work with a whole bunch of clinicians, so speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, psychologists and psychotherapists, and we think about how we can provide the best clinical services to our young people within our schools. So thinking about things like assessments, interventions, but also supporting our teachers and reaching out to our families. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. And Paula, it's the first time I've met you, so welcome onto the podcast.
Thank
How
you
are
for
you?
having me. Yes, I'm really good. Thanks, Rosie.
And what's your role at Options Autism?
So I'm Deputy Head of Clinical Operations for the North, which basically means I support Freya and the wider team to make sure our clinicians are in the right place at the right time to support our young people in the schools. More importantly than that, I'm a speech and language therapist, so that's kind of where my background clinically comes from, and I support kind of across the North with that.
Thank you. What is demand avoidance? It's a phrase you may have heard of, but what do we actually mean by the term demand avoidance? So today we're going to be talking about demand avoidance, which can be a slightly contentious issue. So I'm going to defer to you, Freya, and just get you to tell me a little bit about what demand avoidance is and how it differs to the sort of usual no's and I don't want to's that you might see in every child.
Yeah, so Rosie, so demand avoidance is something where young people experience either intense distress, maybe intense anxiety or intense overwhelm and become almost dysregulated when a demand is placed upon them. So that could be something like asking them to stop doing something, to start a new task. And that young person might become very overwhelmed by that demand. And it could even be something that they really like as well. So you might be offering them something that they enjoy, but the demand of that thing might have then become overwhelming for that young person.
So it's not it's not as straightforward as a child simply saying no to things they don't want to do. This demand avoidance can come about when it's an activity that they would usually enjoy. Would we see it perhaps if they were playing a computer game, something like that? Is it always when they're interrupted doing something they love, or can it happen at any time?
Yeah, it can happen at any time. It doesn't have to be just when they're interrupted. So it could be a young person who's, asked to start something. So, either get up in the morning or do something, like brush their teeth. And it could be something that either is a routine part of their day, which they're used to doing and maybe they would have done on their own. But it's the part of it that maybe that there's the demand itself that induces the anxiety, the discomfort, the distress in that young person. So we can all say no. We've all been in that situation, whether we're, young people or grown-ups, where someone asks us to do something that we don't want to do and we can say no. But I suppose demand avoidance is much deeper than that. So it's not that we just don't want to do something, it's that thing is causing us to feel extremely uncomfortable, extremely distressed. And it's almost like preventing a barrier from stopping us from doing that thing.
And so presumably this can have a very big impact on their lives. So Freya, PDA, pathological demand avoidance. We mentioned earlier it's a slightly contentious term. And I just wondered if you could give me a little bit of a background on how it came to be and why some professionals are quite keen to have this included in the diagnostic criteria, whereas other people maybe find it a little bit more disagreeable.
Yeah, it's as you said, Rosie, it is a contentious label. So even pathological demand avoidance itself, there's disagreement about that because other people are saying actually a preferable term might be extreme demand avoidance. And the profile first started to be identified in the 1980s by a clinician called Elizabeth Newsom, and she was looking at a variety of children in her clinic and noticed that there were some children who were displaying these demand avoidant traits. And she began to kind of talk about this profile. And since then, other people have taken on research looking into these young people. So Liz Irons has been really dominant in that field. And there's been lots of different people who've had different voices, kind of some people saying, actually, pathological demand avoidance doesn't exist. People saying pathological demand avoidance, whether it's part of the autism spectrum or whether it's a separate diagnosis. So there's lots of things going on around this sort of profile at the moment. What we do know is the National Autistic Society is sort of saying that actually it's accepted as part of the autism spectrum now. But I think for me, the biggest important thing is actually stepping away from some of that contentious and controversy that could happen and those arguments that people might get into and think, okay, well, what's actually going on for the young people and the families? And regardless of labels, how can we actually help and support those young people and their families?
What is school refusal? A child's persistent difficulty in attending schools is known as school refusal. It can stem from a variety of underlying factors. Let's hear some.
So I'm a parent of 3 neurodivergent children, 2 of which are grown and flown the nest now, and 1 that's still at home. He's recently found school incredibly challenging, and that led to a quite significant period of school refusal. And so, that's been a real big challenge for us because we could never predict when it was going to happen or what it was going to look like. And sometimes he'd be very much an hour before going, yes, absolutely, I'm going to school. And then when he had to step over the threshold of leaving the house, he just couldn't do it. So, absolutely. I've lots of experience firsthand of that.
And how old is your son?
He's 14 in 2 weeks.
So it's not a simple case, as lots of people will say, just get them there. Just get them to school, because I don't know about you, but my 14-year-old is 6'2". I can't force him to go anywhere. So if you've got a child that is, and also why would you want to distress them so much? But obviously you've then got the concern that he's not accessing education. So how are you managing that?
It's been difficult, Rosie. This has been the most difficult thing I've ever done as a parent. We are lucky in that we have an SEN school place to start next week. But it has been, thank you. It has been a real uphill battle. And part of that has been that school haven't always seen the need to decide which battles we do want to fight. So there was an example where he'd been out of school for a couple of weeks. We'd managed to get him through the school doors and they sent him home within 20 minutes because he was wearing the wrong shoes. So as a parent, when you're absolutely every day really trying to encourage your child to be in education and school are perhaps just wanting to stick to the rules, that actually there has to be a little bit of give and take around those demands to make it work, because that then just resulted in more missed education for him, because then he didn't go into school for maybe another month.
Another month?
Yeah, absolutely.
And as parents, we know the phrase pick your battles, and never does it apply more than when you're parenting a neurodivergent child. And I've got 4 children, 2 are neurodivergent, 2 are not. And we've had to have some quite big conversations about why the other 2 may appear to be treated differently. And it's because if I place things as a demand, they won't do them. So it has to, I'm thinking at home, things like it has to be a suggestion. Oh, have you thought about having a shower today? Rather than you have to have a shower today. But in terms of this really severe avoidance around school, it must be so detrimental to so many children in terms of getting their academic achievements, but also so completely overwhelming and terrifying for parents.
Absolutely. And, I'm in a fortunate position. I've spent 25 years working in this sector. I know it inside and out. I know the people to speak to and when to talk to them and what it needs to look like. And it's been incredibly stressful and really a high load on us as parents to manage it. And I couldn't imagine going through it and not knowing the things that I know. I can see I'm a member of a number of forums, and I can can see parents burning out from
Yeah.
the pressure of that, and I totally understand it.
Because it has such a social impact as well, because if you've got a child that will essentially appear to defy you in public, it can be quite, you feel quite judged. I mean, we feel like we're judged as parents, 99% of the time anyway, but for special needs parents, this is exacerbated. And so you then perhaps begin to retreat. You're not accessing the same activities that you're not creating the same network. So things like online platforms are a really, really valuable resource.
Yeah, absolutely. We were recently in a situation where we'd arranged to meet some friends at a trampoline park. He was really excited about going, and we got in the car park and he refused to get out the car. He's 6 foot. We're not forcing him into a trampoline park. But it was a point where we had to say, actually, this is just too much. But almost we could have done with that social connection with our friends as much as he could have done with the trampoline park on that day. And so I can absolutely see how parents would say, I'm not going to do that because it's just too stressful and it's too much of a demand on us as parents to manage that in the moment.
Understanding the traits of demand avoidance. Dysregulation, upset, anger, anxiety and distraction are all traits of demand avoidance. Let's find out more. Can you give us a few more examples of how it might exhibit in children?
Yeah, so it could be, for a young person, when a demand is requested of them, that they become extremely dysregulated. So they could become very upset or they could become angry. It could also be that they also get very skillful at learning how to avoid demands. So, for example, using distraction. So as a parent, you might kind of, ask your young person, oh, should we go out today? Oh, well, actually, I'm just going to do this, or how about this, or could you tell me about this? So they could get really skilled in that kind of distraction. So then as a parent, you've then kind of lost track and gone something else and the demand has been avoided. These children generally are also described as being a little bit more comfortable in sort of things like role play and social play. They can also sometimes be a little bit more obsessional with their relationships as well. So there's a few different things that we would look at. I think one of the things to remember with those sort of demand avoidant profiles is that they're not currently a diagnostics criteria. So there isn't like autism or ADHD where we would have a clear diagnostic criteria which would allow us as clinicians to kind of look at. But there are traits that we know. So I think it's just really important to be aware of that.
Thank you. When parents of neurodivergent children hear the acronym PDA, and I've heard it in relation to one of my children, and you sort of do a bit of a because it's got this quite scary reputation. And I'm just wondering whether you, Freya, could offer a little bit of sort of, I guess, maybe reassurance to parents out there who have heard it, maybe are seeing some traits in their child and are concerned because, are they ever going to brush their teeth? What does it mean for their future?
So, Rosie, yeah, it can be a daunting label really to think about. But actually, if we think about it from a perspective of a profile, that can be really helpful because what you can do then is kind of understand why a young person or child might be struggling and in what situations they might be struggling. I think for me, it's also really important to distinguish what might be demand avoidance associated with autism. So, for example, I don't want to brush my teeth because I don't like the sensory experience of the toothpaste. I don't like the cold water. I don't like the bristles. And actually, that's not necessarily that I'm avoiding that demand. That's I'm avoiding an unpleasant sensory experience. So sometimes autistic young people might avoid something because they don't like it or because of that experience. Whereas another young person, it might be more the fact that you've asked, please can you brush your teeth? It might be the demand that's being the sort of the cue to the distress there. So I think parents, if their young person has either a profile or has a description that allows the parents and those working with that child and the child themselves to actually understand what's going on, I think that can be really helpful. I think, again, we need to move away from kind of some of those constructs of is or isn't, is it this, is it that, and actually move towards the when am I struggling and how can you best help me? So what's the best strategy for this? Because again, some of those things could be, if you do put a demand on me, that feels really overwhelming. But if you say, oh, I wonder who can get this done the fastest, I feel really excited about doing something and I feel better about doing it. So I think it's about thinking about what's driving and how best that understanding that drive can then support the strategies that we use to support that young person and that family.
And actually, in a home setting, that could be something as simple as something I've employed in my house, which is different toothpaste. there's about 4 different toothpastes in the kids' bathroom, because one has strawberry, one will have mint, and it means that that real sensory overwhelm of a mint toothpaste for an autistic child was taken away, and now they brush their teeth. Supporting your child with a PDA profile. Moving on, there are a number of techniques and strategies which can be employed to support a child with a PDA profile, making everyone's life easier. I'm wondering, Paula, if you've got any other sort of guidance for parents who have got a child with a PDA profile, and if there's different approaches, because I read when I was doing some research that you really shouldn't compliment a young person with demand avoidance. Now that would kind of be, that's my default position. So why is that?
Yeah, absolutely, because it feels like a demand to that young person.
Wow.
And they will sometimes feel like, I will never achieve that again, or if I do it again, I might not be praised to the same level I was previously. So it's really hard. It's, you know, part of what I absolutely would do with all of my children. But being really focused on the job at hand and the achievement rather than praising that person directly can be a real positive. So saying, you know, things like, that's a really good job on that artwork is better than you have done a really good job on that artwork, because you take the spotlight off that young person and so they stop feeling that demand as intently.
Is there, I suppose you could then go the other way and think, oh, I mustn't say anything too complimentary. I suppose it's finding a fine balance, because these children presumably do still need praise and affirmation and, you know, to be told how loved and precious they are. But you've just got to try and formulate your language a little bit differently. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our house, we use a thumbs up. It's
Yeah.
a very natural thumbs up. That's a good job. We're not gushing with praise. It's very low key. It gives that message of we're really happy about that, but in a way that doesn't feel invasive for him. So yeah, a simple thumbs up, a smile, you know, a tap on the back. Working with your young person and finding out what they can tolerate and what feels okay to them is really important.
And Freya, you mentioned as well about sort of timing things, you know, making them into a competition, kind of gamifying. And actually, that's something I do at home. It'll be, you know, I don't want to put my shoes on. Can you do it in 5 seconds? So these are all strategies that can be employed simply at home to make your life and your child's life a little bit easier. And presumably, consistency is really, really key here. So if you've got the school employing some strategies and home employing different ones, that's confusing for any child, but particularly with a child that's got additional needs. How can schools support? I'm going to put this one to you, Paula.
Absolutely. It's about really thinking about their demands and how they present things. So school is very demand heavy. A young person will be asked continually through the day, instructed to do a variety of things. And really working with the school to say, actually, this works best at home and you might want to try that at school. So in our household, non-direct pieces of information. So people who need snacks can really help bring the shopping in.
Nice.
will work. Whereas if I say, you need to come and help me bring the shopping in, that's a straight off demand. It's really thinking about how you approach things. What's really important for schools when working with young people with a demand avoidance profile is to make the young person feel like they're doing things in collaboration with. So it is we all need to,
Yes.
We are going to do this together. I'm going to help you. It's all about that collaboration, that working together, so that, again, the spotlight is not on that young person, because we know that raises anxiety and will definitely produce a demand avoidance behaviour in that moment.
Now, we know that children who are autistic do not lack empathy. We know this. This is a real old misconception. And I'm wondering, if you've got a child that's exhibiting demand avoidance, if you sort of say to them, for example, if you don't help me, or if the family doesn't help, I have to do all of this. I sometimes see that has a positive impact, because sometimes a child won't be thinking that if they don't pick up all their clothes, you've got to go around and do however many children's clothes on your own. Whereas if they do contribute their one bit, they're making a contribution to the family and to the kind of society, I suppose, in terms of your family dynamic. And I'm wondering if that's something that sometimes works, if you sort of play into then their an empathetic side of them.
I would say for some young people, yes, but for some other young people with demand avoidance, you're then putting almost a disappointment in their behaviour on them. So they will start to feel quite anxious about completing that task or not completing that task because they're aware that they're disappointing you by not doing it. And so it will lead to raised anxiety and, well, I'm better not doing it at all. And then no one's disappointed. Everyone knows where they stand, rather than sometimes doing it and sometimes not doing it. So sometimes kind of having things on a schedule like that is helpful because it's not one person saying you need to go and tidy your room. It is on Saturday mornings, rooms get tidied.
We all tidy our rooms, yeah.
And it's on a list and it's just routine and nobody's putting a demand on. It's just what happens in our house. If it doesn't happen, no one says anything, and we just will roll it over till next Saturday. And that can be tough as a parent. It makes my eye twitch as I walk past his bedroom, but I know that day the demand was too much, and so we just let it go.
Because I found if I become sort of militant and draconian in terms of, your room must be tidied on a Monday morning before you go to school, that's not going to work in my house. But we always say, right, everybody should have their room ready to be cleaned on a Monday. And if it's not tidy, it won't be cleaned. So there's no severe consequence. I just shut the door because I found, much like we were talking about earlier, picking your battles. Does it really matter to me if there's 7 days worth of pants on the floor? I don't like it, but it's not the end of the world, is it?
No, and if you're all working together in the house and everybody else is cleaning and tidying and making their spaces nicer, it's much easier for a young person to buy into that, and they feel sort of co-regulated.
So how then would you tackle something like a very, very untidy bedroom? Do you let your blood boil, or are you able to sort of let that one slide a little bit?
With very much believers of shutting the door and trying not to think about it. But in our house, absolutely, on a Saturday, we'll all be working on the same things, all cleaning our own space. It helps our young person be like everybody else in the house is doing it. I think I can probably do it. We'll pass each other things in the hallway. There's a duster, there's some bin bags, and kind of try and get that momentum going so no one feels like it's a demand just on them. It is something we're all doing together as a family to make our space nicer and tidier. It doesn't always work. There will be some days that are an absolute no, and we keep the door closed and we leave it for another week and hope that the next Saturday is a bit better.
Yeah, and in the great scheme of things, some pants on the bedroom floor is not the end of the world. And it obviously does sometimes get to a point where it becomes unmanageable, at which point, what do you do then?
My child goes to his grandparents once a fortnight for an overnight stay, and we will just do his room for him.
Yeah.
That's it. We just take over and do it because, we know that the demand's too much for him right now. So we just take control of that as parents, and he comes back to a nice, lovely
And does he mind?
He doesn't mind. He doesn't mind. And I think he's quite relieved sometimes that we've taken that decision and
taken it off his mind, because in a neurodivergent mind, there's so much going on. We talk about the busy bees, and I think that's a really kind thing to do, just to sometimes go, I'll take that for you. I'll take that little burden away for you. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts you can give to a neurodivergent child, is just sometimes going, I will do that for you.
And we never talk about it. So he came back from a stay yesterday. I didn't say to him, I've tidied your room while you've been out. We just don't mention it.
Because that would be a demand to say thank you. Yeah. Oh, I'm getting it now. How can schools support a child with a PDA profile? Teachers and schools can make small tweaks which can make a big difference to neurodiverse children and young people. Here's what the experts say. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about school. So as I'm listening to Paula talk, I'm thinking about mainstream schools, which may, at primary level, have a class of at least 30, most of them. In a class of that size, with a very mixed intake, how can teachers possibly accommodate this? And are they willing to?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Rosie. And I think if we think about, a busy mainstream classroom, it could be really difficult to think about, how we can change our language for just one person. But actually, if we think about a lot of the strategies that work really well for neurodivergent young people, especially those who maybe do have a more demand avoidant profile, actually those strategies would work well for lots of young people. Mm-hmm. So again, if I'm, a young person who's a little bit anxious about my performance in school, if a teacher, just maybe uses slightly different language, that might be also helpful for me as well. So again, I think it's those little tweaks that a mainstream school or a mainstream class or teacher could do that could make that classroom much more inclusive. So again, rather than saying, at 10 o'clock, everyone is going to be doing quiet reading, and that's what you've got to do, and there's no choice. Simple as that. It could be at 10 o'clock, everyone can go and choose a book. And then, so again, we're just slightly shifting and changing our language. So there are lots of little things that people can do. Now, again, depending on that young person's presentation, their complexity, kind of what's going on for them, that it might not be the right environment for them. And I think everything, I suppose with the majority of things that we talk about when we talk about neurodivergence, it is a very individualised thing. And, what might work really well for one young person might not work well for another, and they might need, additional support in terms of additional support within that one school, or they may need additional support in a different school.
And are there specific schools designed to support children who've got a PDA profile?
So I think schools that have, maybe a special educational needs focus, that have very small classrooms, that have a clinical team that can support those teachers with things like communication strategies, with creating the right environment. So yes, I think there are schools that can kind of really support children to engage in their learning in a way that's driven by that young person, rather than it's being driven by a curriculum or being driven by a demand.
And it's just a luxury that most mainstream schools just cannot offer. But I really like what you said about these kind of small tweaks, because it's like we said about the toothpaste, buying a different brand of toothpaste. It's not an arduous thing to do. Sometimes it is if you can't get it in stock, but that's another subject. And using your language slightly differently in a classroom could actually benefit the other children as well. Well, that brings us to the end of a fascinating first half of our discussion on demand avoidance. But it's a detailed subject and there are still many interesting aspects to delve into. So please join Freya, Paula and myself in part 2.